Welcome to Peoples and Things, where we explore human life with technology. I'm Lee Vinsel. Brothers and sisters of the P&T, welcome to a new episode. Before we get going, a little bit of business. Those hardcore P&T siblings out there may have noticed that we have switched to a new release schedule in the last few weeks. For a long time, we aspired to be a weekly show, but in reality, what we would have is a batch of shows released weekly and then a gap, sometimes a long gap, where I would be burnt out and laying in a puddle somewhere. It wasn't smart or sustainable, but then we realized if we went bi-weekly, that is every 2 weeks, well, problem solved. So we have a sustainable path on our hands. Indeed, if we can just pull off the interviews we have already scheduled, we will already have episodes ready for June 2025, nearly a year out. It feels good. We can imagine going back to weekly someday, but honestly, it would take more money and staff than we currently have, so we'll see. For now, expect a new hot P&T episode to hit your podcasting app every 2 weeks. We'll have some more business announcements in coming episodes. For example, we can already see P&T episode 100 on the horizon, so stay tuned for more news. Earthiness, the ground, soil, dirt, in all of its funkiness, with dark, heavy smells of musk. When I hear folks talking about the risks of technology, and I don't know, they're going on about algorithmic bias, which is like a magnetic attractor of attention, or the threat of LLMs or whatever the fuck, I'm like, I don't know. What about how Catherine Coleman Flowers has taught us about how poor people in the rural South lack septic tanks, and they come into contact with human feces so regularly that so-called tropical diseases have reemerged in states like Alabama, huh? How about that? And it's not because I have a juvenile sense of humor that I go to poop in such contexts, or maybe I should say, it's not only because of my juvenile sense of humor. It's because I care about pain and suffering in actual ordinary reality. The pain of the poor and how their lives are made worse by things like lack of septic tanks, lead in their water, lack of access to transportation, all of the ordinary, earthy things of life. A while back, I wrote an essay about this called Start Where the Pain Is, Notes on Topic Selection in Technology Studies. For a long time, I had been beating up on science and technology studies because so many of its practitioners chase hypey technologies. And in Start Where the Pain Is, I drew out something that I'd said briefly in other places, which is that if we care about human suffering, and this is kind of a standard issue academic stance, especially amongst people who perform being on the left side of the political spectrum, that we care about the problems in the world and how people suffer. If we really care about human suffering, then we should start where the pain is and work to understand what material factors are giving rise to that pain. I mean, it's the only thing that makes sense. Instead, what we get are people who dub themselves critics. Oh, I'm critical. But instead of actually thinking critically, they chase hypey emerging technologies and then imagine harms that might come from these technologies someday. It was important to me when writing that essay to point to good work being done today that has started where the pain is. Otherwise, it's like an imaginary possibility of scholarship that doesn't exist. No, there are people doing it right today. It's just you and your little homies who are doing it wrong. So, for instance, I pointed to the work of former PNT guest Julia Ticona. I think her book, Left to Their Own Devices, is a wonderful example of how to study the ways in which digital technologies are enmeshed with the pain and suffering of the working class. I also pointed to the work of the interesting urban planner Theo Lim, who has an interesting project looking at urban heat problems in the city of Roanoke, Virginia. Again, the ordinary, the earthy, it doesn't get much earthier than the pain that comes from hot asphalt and bricks. And I pointed to the work of my good buddy, Raquel Velho, an associate professor of science and technology studies at Rensselaer Polytechnic Institute. In this conversation, Raquel and I talk about her new book, Hacking the Underground, Disability, Infrastructure, and London's Public Transport System, which provides a fascinating ethnographic investigation of how disabled people navigate a transportation system that is far from accessible. Raquel finds disabled passengers constantly hacking and finding workarounds, including lots of fixie maintenance tasks to get from one place to another. While these workarounds obviously involve lots of creativity, they are also the products of an unequal system and the failure to enact a more thoroughgoing and radically transformative redesigning of public transportation systems in the name of accessibility. And I think the book is a beautiful example, much like Ticona's, of how social scientists can use methods, in this case, ethnographic interviewing, to get at what Raquel and others call the frictions of technology. And whether we call it friction or we focus on the friction that induces pain, it's the earthiness of it all that should draw our attention. I had a great time talking to my old buddy, Raquel. I hope you enjoy our conversation. Hey, get excited! Raquel, thanks so much for taking the time to talk to me today.
Thanks for having me, Lee. It's a pleasure.
So, Hacking the Underground is a neat book. I recently talked about it in an essay as an example of how to do things right. And I was, if I don't know if this is this question I always ask, but if you're explaining it to a stranger, if that's something we still do these days, what do you tell them it's about, and what were you trying to do with this thing?
Yeah, it's funny. I feel like I have like two versions of the book that I talk to people about. I'll have the version that I'll talk to people that are in academia or around academia that I can get a little bit more intense with in terms of what I was really trying to do intellectually with the book.
Yeah.
And then I'll have the version that I use to talk to cousins and friends and stuff.
Do the cousins version first.
Okay, so the cousins version is I'm really fascinated by boring stuff, right? This kind of follows on Susan Lee Starr's Society of People Interested in Boring Things. And when I moved to London, I was really fascinated with prosthetics and started kind of going down a path thinking that I was going to really study the history of prosthetics. And then got introduced to people that worked on public transportation. And when I got introduced to these engineers and they started talking to me about the type of research that they were doing around accessibility, I was like, that sounds fascinating, because I feel like one of the things that I see all the time in the news in London is the difficulties with accessibility. So I was really fascinated by that topic because it ended up being that, every time you see the world's top 10 transportation systems, lists, London is always there, right? It's got this really rich kind of history. So I couldn't really understand why it was that this transportation system that is allegedly so good and so extensive was just constantly on the news for its failures for a very particular population. So that's what the book is about, really. It's the book is trying to understand why it is that we have infrastructures that can be so good or allegedly can be so celebrated, and like in a really kind of mediatic way, including becoming the symbol of a city.
Right.
And yet still have full populations that it leaves behind and that it lets down.
Yeah.
So I really wanted to kind of understand, like, how does this, I mean, I don't love the term paradox anymore, but like, how can this paradox arise in that type of situation? So the book kind of traces, all right, let's talk about the history of transportation. Let's kind of understand the history of transportation in London, but let's see where the gaps are in that history. And then let's really talk about experience, and let's try and understand experience of a really big thing as a hyper-localized, individualized aspect. So I was really trying to contend with different questions of scale. And what I ended up finding, and this is the bit that I always tell my cousins, is like, I found that like wheelchair users and disabled passengers are often perceived by the majority of society as like passive members of society, like are often locked out of a lot of institutions, a lot of public spaces. But when it comes to the way that they navigate public transportation, they're the ones that are the most active passengers. They need to be aware of their environment the entire time. They need to be coming up with these really creative hacks and ways of like fixing and figuring out the system for themselves in a way that nobody who's not disabled really has to. So when I tell people that, right, they'll then start thinking about it and be like, that's really funny. I remember when I like had a broken leg after going on a ski trip and trying to get around in New York City, and how miserable it was, right? So like it ends up being a topic that everybody has some kind of experience with in the end. And it's really great because it like people start then talking to me about their own experiences with with their world, with their built environment in a completely different way. So it's been really cool to kind of like have that version of the talk that I can like give to friends and just kind of be like, oh yeah, like now that I have a kid and I'm trying to get around with like a baby in a pram, I'm just miserable half of the time and I never use public transit anymore.
Right. Yeah, I mean, I do think there's this, your focus on experience, and maybe we can talk about American pragmatism later. We'll see if that happens. But like, no, your focus on experience, and I feel like it connects to a lot of disability stuff, is like, you know, you might have an injury, you might have a broken leg that's going to improve, but temporarily you're like in a space that you have a new experience, or you have kids, or you're trying to get like an elderly parent through someplace. There are these ways that we can kind of like people who are able-bodied, it'll snap their focus into understanding how someone who doesn't have their abilities normally experience these things, right?
Yeah,
they're like viewpoints.
It's also a reminder of how our abilities fluctuate all of the time.
Yeah,
right. There's like that's one of the aspects that I think is really great is like and of centering disability in a lot of our research is that it is that reminder that like the materiality of the world and our bodily materiality are constantly in relationship with one another. So when like our bodies break down in different ways in different moments in life, like you would want a world that's flexible and supportive enough to kind of pick you up in those moments, right? Like even talking to friends who are going through pregnancies, like those are the moments when they're exhausted, they're trying to like get to work on time and they're throwing up and there's like no flexibility around that. Like even talking about those momentary times, nobody wants to talk about pregnancy as like a disability. And I understand like we can get into like disability studies and critical disability studies around that. But I think just the constant reminder that our bodies fluctuate, our needs fluctuate in different moments of our lives. And sometimes we don't have the structures that support those changes. And that book was really kind of trying to contend with, yes, it's it's one of the things that I try to capture in the book at times is like wheelchair users' abilities fluctuate as well. And there's this like constant awareness of themselves and their bodily needs and mapping on to, okay, I'm exhausted today. I'm not like, I interviewed somebody who has both an electric wheelchair as well as a manually powered wheelchair. So whenever he was feeling really tired, he would use the electric powered wheelchair. And in that moment, he was just like, well, if I'm using the electric powered wheelchair, it's a heavier chair. I need to make different decisions about how I'm going to get around. The battery might die on me, so I need to stay closer to home. Right. So there's these like calculations that enter because there's this awareness of the body and the relation with the built environment.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. So, I was going to ask you how you got into this. I think like you gave us a version of it. So if I heard it right, you, and all, how you got into this and also the research you did. So it sounds like you were interested in kind of disability studies going in. You were thinking about doing prostheses. Then you start talking to engineers. How did you end up hooking up with these wheelchair users, and like how did that connection happen? So it sounds like you're saying like you met these engineers, they started kind of keying you into this issue around accessibility and the built environment. But then, yeah, how'd you end up kind of doing this ethnography with the users themselves?
Yeah. So I got to shout out, I guess, all the people that were involved in the process. I was told that I'm like supposed to downplay the fact that this is like a doctoral dissertation originally, but I like talking that up.
I think that's crazy.
I know. It's like they were like, in the acknowledgments, be careful to make it like not make it very obvious.
People are ridiculous.
But that's one of the things that I think is really great is like, I think for graduate students, it's really good to know which books are originally, right? The doctoral dissertation. So this is the result of actually, in a way, both my master's and my PhD.
Okay.
My master's was my pilot project for the PhD. And then the book really is based on the empirical work that I did on the PhD.
Mm-hmm.
I did my PhD in the Science and Technology Studies department at University College London. I have so much love for that department. I will talk them up every single time I get a chance to. It's such a supportive place. And when I got there for my master's, one of the best things about the UCL STS department is that it is a very interdisciplinary STS department. They have historians of technology. They have philosophers of science. They have people like Jack Stilgoe who are science policy, have science policy tendencies. They'll have sociologists. So everybody is kind of working together.
Yeah.
So I went in thinking I don't know, I've read some Haraway in my undergrad. I read some random sociology of science stuff, some random philosophy of science. So I kind of want to try and do some history. There's an opportunity to do history. I thought I was going to do a history of prosthetics, particularly as I imagine it at the time as a 22-year-old, the history of how prosthetics are becoming more and more inserted in the body. That was kind of my thought. There was a lot was going on in the early 2010s or 20-teens around targeted reinnervation surgery for prosthetics, prosthetic limbs in particular. So I kind of wanted to trace that history. And the summer before my master's started, I actually spent the summer interviewing a woman who was a tetra amputee. So she had both her arms and her legs amputated. And I think those interviews are part of the reason why I started thinking about experience in the ways that I did, because I would talk to her about her experience with prosthetics and how she was adapting. She was a new amputee and she adapted great to her legs, but she hated her arms. She completely stopped using her super high-end bionic arms within 5 months, 6 months of getting them. And she was just they just don't do what I want them to do. They don't work the way I want them to work. They're heavy. They're uncomfortable. Every time that I would think about disability, there was something that in prosthetics, there was that conversation kind of stood out. I spoke with her maybe 10 times over the summer before going in, and we had coffee, and I just, that kind of stuck out. And then I get to the master's and get introduced to these engineers that are working on access by Brian Balmer, who's a sociologist in the Science and Technology Studies department. And he knew Catherine Holloway. And Catherine Holloway, who is, at the time, she was at the Pamela Lab, which was a pedestrian accessibility laboratory, basically.
Okay.
She was doing this work on accessibility with the Accessibility Research Group at UCL. And Brian heard me talk about prosthetics, and he was like, I think you think about prosthetics very narrowly. Have you considered thinking about assistive technologies more broadly? I should introduce you to Catherine. She's working on various forms of assistive technologies and access. So when I meet them, one of the things that I was saying was like, great, I'm very curious about accessibility and I want to work with you guys on this, but I want to understand how people experience access. Like you guys are doing all this research on like ramp grades, for example.
Yeah, right, sure.
Right?
Yeah.
Like, which is great. Like one of the things that they were doing, and this was like my first peer-reviewed publication was in collaboration with them, was basically like a how do you call this? Like multi-methods kind of approach to talking about the issues around access. So I talk about the social issues and they talk about like the physical limitations of accessibility regulations. And one of the things that they did in the experiment that we did together was they would measure things like limb force, like joint force that was needed to like that wheelchair users needed to exert to get on a stationary bus. But this bus was like the dream scenario, right? It's an experiment. So these are wheelchair users that are wearing all of these sensors with a special wheel on their wheelchair to push into the bus.
Yeah.
There's nobody on the bus.
Right.
It's not trying to get anywhere. They have as many tries as they possibly want.
Right.
So like the results from the engineering side were things like, yeah, actually, it turns out that the regulation of like 12% grade is already like enough to cause significant injury over repeated amounts of time doing this type of movement. So like that biomechanical finding was really important.
Yeah, sure.
But then I would interview wheelchair users about their experience with the experiment and about their experience with access. And they were like, this is the dream scenario. There's nobody on the bus. I can take as many, like you guys were super patient. Like the reality of trying to get on a bus is completely different from this. And it's so much worse than this.
Yeah.
So like, they're not even thinking about the ramp grade, right? They're just like, when I'm trying to get on a bus, there are people screaming at me. There's like a parent with a kid in a pram, like in the wheelchair space, or there are tourists with luggage that I need to scream at, or the bus driver pretends that he doesn't even see me. There will be like this litany of things that can go wrong. So like this was child's play.
Yeah.
So that was like, that kind of discrepancy was kind of playing even more on that question of like, what are we doing when we design things? Like that's ultimately what I like to think about a lot because I teach in the Design, Innovation, and Society program at RPI.
Yeah.
And I teach students to think about the design process and like, how do you define a problem, right? And like how people are conceiving of accessibility as a problem is very different depending on who you are.
Right.
So like, sure, for the engineers, that was a serious biomechanical concern of injury over time. And like, what are we going to do about this grade issue in the regulations? But for the wheelchair users, it was like, yeah, I'm sure that's true. But at the same time, like when the bus is in a real life situation, most of the time I can't even get on it. Like that's the issue to begin with.
Mm-hmm. That makes a lot of sense. So, and then what you did like 2 years of, you followed people, right? I mean, you would just go with them through their experience. You interviewed them, but you'd also ride along with them, right?
I didn't do that many ride-alongs. I did like 2 days, 2 afternoons of ride-alongs. And the crucial one was with Alan and his partner, Yvonne. And that's kind of the opening vignette of the book is spending the afternoon with Alan. I actually learned, and this was terrible to find out, that Alan passed away at the end of last year. So he's like another person that I interviewed who is no longer with us. But like Alan was one of the most important people to me in this research. He sat down with me for like a 2-hour interview the first time that we met. We thought it was going to be an hour, but then it was like 2 hours long. And at the end of it, he was like, you know, I do these like ride-alongs with politicians. Like I invite policymakers to do this. I speak a little bit less about it in the book than I do in the dissertation, but it's like a strategy that Transport for All, which is like a organization in London fighting for accessibility, actually use. Like these ride-alongs.
I get it.
Which is super cool.
Yeah.
So Alan was like, why don't you come spend an afternoon with me and see what it's like? And that was like, that was like a turning point for a lot of stuff, I think.
Yeah.
Like even in terms of how I interviewed people after that.
Totally.
It was really eye-opening.
Yeah, man. I just I interview Jennifer Hart. I don't know if you know. She's the chair of history here at Tech, but she's an Africanist, but she's because she's an Africanist, she's a historian. Writes as a historian, but she does a lot of ethnography too. And I feel like ethnography is one of these things. I'm writing a lot about methods these days. Ethnography is one of these things where you do it, and then it shapes the other stuff, even if your study is going to be primarily interview-based or whatever, right? I mean, just
Yeah.
going and laying your eyes on things, going and experiencing things with people has very strong shaping effects on, like, then how what you're looking for, the questions you're asking, all that kind of stuff.
I mean, we can get into American pragmatism there if you want.
Yeah,
I'm
go
not going
for
to
it.
do it. But I mean, it's part of like what Peirce would call like abductive reasoning, right? It's like this like constantly recursive process of observation is interruption into processes of thinking. It's never this static like taking in. So I think that was really crucial. And I've had this compliment. I don't know if it was a compliment or an insult at this point. It's been leveled at me twice in slightly different ways, where people say that I am the most humanities legible social scientist they've ever come across.
Interesting.
Which I think is really interesting because I do consider myself a sociologist, if for no other reason than my undergraduate degree is in sociology. And I do primarily use interviews as a method, or I have. For this project, I primarily used interviews as a method. But there was something even in the way I think that I viewed interviews at the time that was it felt very different than just like, we're going to sit down for like this neutral conversation where I'm collecting very particular questions from you.
Yeah.
Like I would meet people in their homes, like a lot of the time because of like access concerns. Sure. Or in their local cafes, or in like their place of work. And it was always because of that. And this is whenever I teach students observation now or ethnographies, like that's one of the things that I tell them is like, when you are doing that type of work, the environment that you're in is going to tell you so much about the person that you are talking to as well. Yeah. Yeah. So I got invited to the Transport for All office, and I use this example in the classroom all the time. And like I walk into the office and there are posters everywhere about the social model of disability and like definitions about the social model of disability. And like I tell students, like that tells you something about their commitments. That tells you something about the organization beyond something then. I mean, you could sit down and ask the person, do you believe in the social model of disability?
Right. No, but the material culture tells you so much more.
Exactly.
Yeah.
So there's like that process of ethnography as well.
Yeah. And so if listeners aren't familiar with the social model of disability, why don't you spell that for them?
Sure. So the social model of disability, and this is probably going to say something about my UK training, despite the Americanist accent. So the social model of disability kind of stands in contrast with what is then called the medical model of disability. There's a lot of scholars in like the 70s in the UK of disability studies that in essence are saying like, the notion of disability is not an individualized issue in the person's body. It is ultimately a mismatch of what society offers with like the person's needs. Yeah. Right. So the problem isn't the individual body. The problem is society. And that is how disability is effectively constructed.
Got it.
So this was like pretty revolutionary in the 70s in terms of being able to make pretty specific policy demands. And Harriet Beckett, who's at the University of Leeds, I can't remember her co-author for this piece. The social model of disability has had a lot of people kind of come up against it, in large part because it says it doesn't account enough for experience, actually, like embodied experience, right, of bodily difference or different capabilities. So there have been things like the phenomenological model of disability and things like that. But one of the things that Harriet Beckett says in response to a lot of these critiques is that the social model is ultimately used as an oppositional device. So it was like a critical thing to have been developed in that moment as a political tool for gathering, like as an umbrella group, gathering disabled individuals and disabled organizations to be able to demand for change.
Yeah. No, that makes a lot of sense to me. And, okay, I got to back up for a second because I forgot to talk to you about something. Now, Raquel, my friend, I would never accuse you of being like an STS Nepo kid or something, but is it not the case that your mother is like an STS scholar too?
It is. It is.
So did you like grew up around this stuff, kinda? I mean, not that you were like talking to mom about STS at the dinner table in high school or whatever.
That's so funny because yes. And I guess we do have to, I mean, one of my colleagues, Jim Alazita, like, I remember when he first found out about this and he just started calling me Legacy.
Yeah.
I'm calling Jim out.
Good, Jim.
So number one, it's like continuous evidence of the type of like social reproduction of academia, right? So
Totally.
I want to like start off with that.
Yeah.
But the thing is, I never understood what my mom did.
Classic.
Which is like very STS, right? Like, like what is it that you do exactly? Like, what is your topic of research? I knew my mom was a professor. Yeah. I understood like the concept of being a college professor.
Yeah.
But beyond that, people would be like, what does your mom do? It's like, I don't know.
Yeah.
It has something to do with biotechnology.
Has that been her focus? Is she like a STS person on biotech or?
You know what? She has worked very widely. So my mom is Professor Raquel Velho. She has had a fantastic career in Latin America and has been a visiting professor at Indiana University and then also at INTEC, which was I think they've changed the name, at the United Nations University in Maastricht. Okay. So she's had a lot of different projects. And my mom actually has a really interesting career because she started off in science policy. Yeah. So she was working for like the Brazilian Ministry of science, like science and education for the longest time. And then she shifted careers pretty late in the game for her life. She got her PhD in the 80s at the University of Sussex. She worked a lot with bibliometrics and citation politics.
She was like a Sprue person?
She was a Sprue person.
Oh, I love that place. Cool.
Yeah. She did her PhD at Sprue. And then she eventually, so they went back to Brazil after my mom defended her PhD. She was still working in the ministry for a little while, and then she shifted careers to academia when I was born, actually. Yeah. So her career in STS is technically as long as my lifespan is.
Got it. Okay. All right.
So, which is kind of neat. But she's worked on a lot. She's worked with biotechnology. She and my father actually collaborated on some research projects over the years as well. With like sugarcane, like the history of sugarcane manipulation in Brazil, and like a lot on agriculture. Her background is originally in agronomy, so yeah, she's had a really fascinating career, and
that's cool, man.
Is a big citation in Latin American STS.
And
a huge source of pride for me,
that's
obviously,
awesome.
Because she's a badass.
That's so cool. So now I want to ask you about another badass STS lady, which earlier your book came out, but earlier I wanted to do like another episode called like the Susan Lee Starr Fan Club with Raquel Velho. Well, so like Susan Lee Starr, I wanted you to kind of like, you are like a big fangirl of Susan Lee Starr. Is that fair?
I'm a huge fangirl of Susan Lee Starr.
Yeah. So tell people about Susan Lee Starr a bit and what you love about Susan Lee Starr.
I have in many venues actually called this book an ode to Susan Lee Starr.
It feels like that at times, yeah.
Yeah. I've been reading Boundary Objects and Beyond again, not the whole book, but especially like Lee's pieces in there.
Yeah. And that's like a collection of her essays, right? It's
a collection of her essays and people using Lee's work as well. Okay. And it's really great. I really recommend people get that book. I think it's really insightful in terms of like how wide-ranging Lee Starr's career was. Yeah. And I think that this is the number one reason why I'm such a huge fan of hers is because if there's any person in STS that has had such a interdisciplinary mind of like, I'm going to work over here and be speaking to people over there and then also be speaking to these other people. Like, I don't know it. Like, I don't know somebody who's published in the ways that she has or has thought with the type of intellectual traditions that she has and has so willingly jumped around and just been like, nah, I'm going to bring in some cognitive science.
Exactly.
I'm going to bring in some computer science.
Yeah. Well, I mean, because like I think that psychology and cognitive science are largely lacking from STS circles. Like, you don't have many people like that showing up to 4S, for instance.
Yeah.
But she's really draws on like all these really broad traditions and synthesizes. I mean, it's just like a wonderful synthetic mind, right?
And it makes perfect sense with the background that she has too, right? So she was trained in psychology originally.
Okay.
So there are reasons, and this is so in getting together all of these little bits of information over the years of Lee Starr and like sitting down with boundary objects more seriously since I finished writing my book.
Mm-hmm.
Like, Lee Starr calls herself a pragmatist a lot and cites John Dewey a lot.
Right.
And John Dewey himself was also in psychology and working a lot in psychology before really getting invested in like more philosophy of science work with he didn't even use the term pragmatism. Mm-hmm. But there's like a really interesting map between those things. And as a result, I mean, it makes perfect sense to bring in cognitive science into the mix, right? Yeah. Like, if that's her background. And I think that this is one of the things that I love about her work is that there's so much in there that is like, it's also related to action theory. Yep. Like, she's constantly working with people in action theory. And I don't know, it's like it's just an incredible mind. Every time I read one of those articles of hers, I'm just kind of blown away about at the level of synthetic ability, but also like the poetry in her work. Yeah. Mm-hmm. And I know that Jeff Bowker, her partner, talks a lot about that. And
she wrote poetry, and he said something like she was happiest when she was writing poetry. Yeah. Like, he knew she was in a good space, something like that.
Absolutely. Right? And I mean, that's also why I say that the book is an ode to her. Like, that's also like an acknowledgement of her love for poetry. And like, she, in one of the, I think it's called Living Grounded Theory is the name of the essay. She talks about how she wept when she found out that John Dewey had died.
Wow.
And I just find that really, like, when I read that little passage, I was really moved because when I found out that Lee Starr had passed before I ever had the opportunity to meet her, I got very like teary-eyed as well. So it was like,
I felt ripped off. I was living in the same city as her, but didn't know about her. When she died, I was in Pittsburgh.
Oh no.
Yeah. But so let's bring it. So, you know, one of the many places, and then this is what's amazing about her is like her breadth, as you've said, but one of the places she's been really influential is in infrastructure studies. So that's one of the like direct ways it comes in. So can you give folks a sense of like what she said about infrastructure and how like why that's important to you? Like what her approach to infrastructure kind of did for your work?
Yeah, I think that this is then the version of like people that are more in academia or more in STS of the book, right? Like, one of my gripes in infrastructure studies has been the way that people have used her and Karen Ruletter's definition of infrastructures as invisible until they break down.
Oh, right. I was going to ask you about that later. Yeah.
Yeah. And like, I think people, and I point this out in the book, is that definition, or the various definitions of infrastructure studies that they offer in that piece, is actually, there's like a caveat before all of that, which is to say, first and foremost, infrastructures are relational. And that, I think, is the crucial bit of Susan Lee Starr's thinking that has everything to do with cognitive science and American pragmatism, that is about relations and is about like connections between things and about action in the world.
Yeah.
So that's what I was really trying to bring into this book, was like, okay, I think in a lot of scholarship around infrastructures, people spend a lot of time on the what of the infrastructure and not in the way that Lee Starr would write the when is an infrastructure. Right? Like, when are the moments when infrastructures are actually gelling and working together, and like all of the components are making sense
Yeah.
together from the user's perspective?
Yeah.
And when are the moments when they are not, when an infrastructure falls apart?
Yeah.
And that crucial thing of like, I think that has everything to do with relation and positionality within a system.
Yeah.
And that's what I was trying to like take from Lee Starr and make more explicit to infrastructure studies.
Totally.
And I joke, like the whole invisibility debate has kind of been really annoying to me, because there's that aspect of like, okay, I don't think from an experience perspective, it is worth my time for me to say something like, we can't say that infrastructures are invisible because they are literally around us and we can see them, right? Like the switch is right here, right? Like the infrastructures are visible. That's not what they're talking about. And like Stephen Jackson has pointed this out in some of his writing on infrastructures and maintenance, that caveat for Lee Starr, or not even the caveat, but the idea of invisibility, he ties it to two intellectual traditions. He ties it to pragmatism. And then he also ties it to Heidegger and like Heideggerian phenomenology.
Yeah.
And that's the thread that I decided to pull on for the book, was to talk about like present at hand and ready to hand as like the critical distinctions of when something doesn't work and when something does work, right? As an experience of an object, of a tool, or of an infrastructure. So
the ready to hand means I can just use the tool. It's there. I don't even think about it, right? And present to hand's like when the screwdriver breaks and then all of a sudden I'm like, oh shit, there's an object and it's fucked up.
There's an object that doesn't serve the purpose that you want it to serve. Yeah. So like that distinction, I think, is essentially, and at times Starr herself uses ready to hand to talk about like the question of visibility, or invisibility rather. It really has, and again, this is what I keep trying to underline, it really has everything to do with experience. It has to do with like the moment of interaction with a space, a thing, a tool. And she actually brought that into infrastructure studies from action theory. Because this is, I can't believe I'm blanking on his name, Angstrom, I believe, who wrote When is a Tool? So she's then pulling this into infrastructure studies for when is an infrastructure. And it's like, again, a very similar thing of like a tool works under very particular circumstances and a particular set of relations, right?
Involving both the environment and the person. And what the person's ability and knowledge and skills and all these kinds of things.
Absolutely. And this is where action theory and even things from habits, like talking about habits in an American pragmatism sense, is really, I think, illuminating.
Beautiful. And then, so I wrote this essay, Start Where the Pain Is, where I, got up on one of my soapboxes and talked about problem selection and how we should do it right. And I held up your book as an example of, what I think, what kind of like the kind of thing I'm trying to get at is like, we can go to the ordinary and like look at what people are experiencing and like, and you in a text message, you said that your guiding concept for you in this study was friction, is that a Susan Lee Starr thing too?
You know what? I don't know that it's necessarily a Susan Lee Starr thing. I take this from my colleague, Amy Hemray, and their work with Kelly Fritsch on like the cryptechnoscience work.
I wanted to ask you about that too, but go ahead. Yeah.
I mean, one of the things that they write about in terms of cryptechnoscience is like that access is friction, right? Like access is always about friction. And to me, that seemed like a really helpful way of thinking about the project. Is we can think about it as pain, I think, in terms of obviously there's human suffering that happens when access doesn't work, right?
Right.
But I felt that friction was a little bit more capturing the wide range of experiences that relate to the stories that were being told to me, right?
Right.
Because access isn't just about pain. Access can be about joy. It can be about collaborative work. It can be about interdependence. It can be about like stories that are really fraught, that aren't just about pain. So like stories like I don't know. One of my, I think he called himself, I'm trying to remember like the pseudonym that he gave himself now, Basil. Basil told me this story about being on the overground train and arriving at his station, but not being able to get out of the train because the person with the ramp that was supposed to be there wasn't there with the ramp. And he was in a train with a bunch of drunk football supporters, and they all like lifted him and his chair out and like took him out, right?
Yeah.
And that was how he got out of the train. And he was like, it was a really complicated moment. Like it was, I was in danger. There's like a bunch of drunk supporters that are like helping me. And at the same time, I'm really grateful that they were there, because otherwise I would have made it to the end of the line and it would have been difficult to make it home. So like those moments of like, there's collaborative work, there's like people watching out for one another. They are very well intentioned, but at the same time, that moment should never have been enabled to happen. So that's what I feel like Friction was really capturing for me. Those types of moments.
Yeah, that makes sense to me. One final kind of like conceptual big picture question before we kind of dive into the organization a bit. But like tell us a bit about you talk about having a crip feminist lens. And maybe I think that's already started to come out in what you've been saying, but say a little bit more about crip feminist as a kind of term and what that means for you.
Yeah. So for me, and I think I detail this in the introduction, there's like a couple of traditions that are feeding into what I'm trying to do.
Yeah.
Feminist technoscience is a big one. This was part of my Ode to Lee Starr section. Like, I actually think that Lee Starr isn't included enough in canons of feminist technoscience. I think she ends up getting put a lot more into the camps of infrastructure studies rather than really like put together with like Haraway or Harding in this very particular feminist technoscience as like reminders that, and this is a very Harawayan xenofeminist manifesto kind of approach of reminding us that technologies hold promises, and they also hold like the capacity for destruction as well as the capacity for like really liberatory work. So that I think is something that I wanted to bring in, is that a reminder that it's really, I don't like what you call that like criti-hype thing that we do with technology. Like this idea, like I don't consider myself a neo-Luddite. Like I'm wearing an Apple Watch and I have like a whole bunch of different technologies that I choose to surround myself with. I believe that there's a lot of evil that is done with technology. I understand that it surfaces from a lot of like terrible military industrial complex processes of creation. But at the same time, like technologies enable, like they are assistive. They perform a lot of important tasks in our lives.
Yeah.
And that to me is like a crucial feminist technoscience point, is embracing the irony that comes with technology and technoscience.
Cool.
And then from the crip perspective, and this really comes from crip technoscience in particular, but also the work of your colleague, Ashley Shu, on like techno ableism, is like this idea that oftentimes there's a perception that technologies are created for disabled people, right?
Yeah.
These assistive technologies are going to cure disabled people in any particular way,
or whatever,
fix them, and are in any kind of way, as though people required that form of fixing.
Yeah.
And I say this as both you and I wearing glasses, right? This is a reminder that like Sarah Hendren gives us, that like all technologies are assistive. So I really wanted to like bring in the perspective that like crip technoscience offers, which is that disabled persons are the creators of their own forms of technology and their own forms of knowledge that need to be understood and incorporated as a part of our canon of what counts as technology and what counts as knowledge. So the crip feminist lens was trying to like contend with the ironies of technology while also accounting for the fact that disabled persons are experts in their world and are creating the forms of liberatory technologies that they need for themselves.
Yeah. Oh man, I'm going to ask you about one more concept. God damn it, I thought I was done. But I want to talk, can you tell me a bit about the term technoscience? So, I mean, there's like crip technoscience, there's feminist technoscience, and then there's this whole other branch of like that talks about technoscience that annoys me more, that often comes from Europe. And I feel like so often the European branch, it's very focused on high technology, often academic labs working on
Mm,
like, the cutting edge of where science and technology are coming together. And it leaves out all the everyday shit. And where actually most technological change comes from is like incremental tinkering in large firms and stuff. Has
totally.
nothing at all to do with science, actually. And so,
Yeah.
like, where did in this kind of like more left leaning spaces like the feminist and disability studies, like why technoscience? Why is that the term? Because
So
like, yeah,
it's really interesting. I was actually speaking with a graduate student a little bit about the term technoscience earlier, because my understanding of it, and I'm happy to have further conversations with people who want to set me right,
yeah,
is that it's really trying to contend with a lot of that distinction, I think, between science studies and technology studies, as
yeah,
though these like separate branches and separate approaches of thinking about the production of science and the
yeah,
production of technology. So I think that there's one aspect there. But speaking about European traditions, what I brought up in conversation was this article by Ari Rip. I can't believe I'm blanking on the name of the article, but I think it's something like technology and science as dancing partners.
yeah,
And Rip is trying to use this type of metaphor of science and technology working together as a reminder that they are really constantly working together in a lot of ways,
yeah.
right? Like science can
Sometimes, yeah.
create technology and new
Hmm.
technology can lead to new scientific
That is
knowledge.
true. Yeah,
And that's kind of the vision that I have of technoscience in the way that Haraway was also integrating it into her
yeah,
work, is this idea that technology and science are really difficult to extricate from one another, especially these days.
yeah.
Like there's a lot of technology that's powered by scientific forms of knowledge, and there's a lot of technology that is generating new forms of science.
That is absolutely
And
true.
and I say that as somebody who's fascinated by big science, right?
Yeah,
Like big
yeah,
science
yeah.
is the
Right.
perfect example of
Yeah,
technoscience, because it's really about the machinery, the huge, like, let's talk about the Large Hadron Collider and synchrotrons and huge
yeah.
observatories, right? Like what they are, it's technology enabling science. But at the same time, to develop those technologies that get used in those spaces, there's also a lot of scientific work that gets done
Yeah.
for that. So it's like, that's how I understand technoscience. This is like constant permutation.
That's interesting. I think in the history of technology, they're seen as two different traditions that come together in some moments, but that
Yeah.
like there's a whole lot of material stuff in our lives that has very little science involved in it, and that's even
Yeah.
more true in poor countries, right? I mean, so it's just like I feel like so often it's like people who are doing like lab studies and are very fixated on emerging technologies and stuff.
Yeah.
Anyway, we could have a long discussion about that, but let's get to. I just want to play out a little bit the book for folks before we like end together. But like, so tell us about your first chapter is like history, right? And so like, what is like getting into the history of the London public transit? Like, why do you want to do that? And what are you setting up by kind of like painting a historical picture here?
Yeah. It felt when I was first writing that history chapter like just another context setting chapter.
Yep.
Um, But importantly, I realized that it wasn't early on in the stages of writing, even the first versions of my dissertation, because I lost count, like over 10 books on the history of public transportation in London. Like, Brits are funny. Like, if they're gonna, like, people have these very particular specializations around like public transportation in London. There's
Yeah.
like a 2-tome volume of over 400 pages each on the history of public transportation in London,
Yeah. Yeah.
because it is long and illustrious,
Yeah.
right? I
Yeah.
mean,
Well,
we're
thank God
talking
for those books. We need them, right?
1830s. Absolutely. I think they're so important. But like, I cannot tell you the amount of hours I spent in the library, like going through these books and just being like, when did I become a transport historian and why am I doing this to
Yeah,
myself?
we can talk about that for a long time too. Yeah.
But yeah, and I mean, just going, I'm sure with your vehicles book as well, it's just like, oh my God. But so I read all of these books, and some of them were more like public facing histories.
Yeah.
And there was no mention of access.
Sure.
in terms of access for disability.
Right.
Anywhere. The few mentions of access that emerged had to do with access to work and access to trains by the working class.
Yep. Sure.
Right? So that became really interesting to me because I then started doing like the history of disability in the UK, right? And studying a little bit more what disability historians were saying about the different places that disabled people were made to occupy in British society. And then we get to say the 80s, the 70s and 80s with like the birth of a lot of these like nothing without us, nothing for us without us movement.
Yeah.
And as soon as that started happening, people were almost immediately talking about transportation and demanding changes in relation to transportation.
That makes sense.
Right?
Yeah.
And then we get to things like the Campaign for Accessible Transport that was just developed by the Disability Actor Network or Disability Action Network in the UK, where they were literally like chaining, these are like disabled people who were chaining themselves up to buses in like Westminster, right?
Yeah.
Like completely freezing downtown London or central London. And none of that is in history books about public transportation.
Yeah.
I was just like, what do you mean this isn't in history books about public transportation? This is like a crucial, these are among the acts that enabled the Disability Discrimination Act that was passed in 1995 in the UK. Like these are like critical moments. So I started realizing that what I needed to do was like weave these two histories together to begin to show how disabled passengers have always been acting on these systems, right? It was like trying to recapture, one, how the term accessibility itself in terms of conceptualization by the network has slowly changed from talking about access in terms of access to leisure for Victorian, like holiday seekers in London or people trying to get to jobs and really talking about commuting places, to talking about access as a right, as a very particular form of right for disabled populations in London. And even how that has become a little bit more complicated these days too, with questions of like access for parents with their children, the limitations of access when it's enshrined in legalese, right? We have things like reasonable adjustment clauses for accommodations in relation to disability, which is something that we don't have with any other protected class or category. So like, okay, now we've enshrined access legally. It becomes something that people can throw the book at in very particular ways and sometimes very nefarious ways. So I was trying to kind of trace that out in that first chapter.
Yeah. And then I see the next two chapters as kind of being in a kind of dialectical relationship with each other, where you in the second kind of body chapter, you talk about designed materiality, which I take it to be kind of like how the spaces are constructed and what that means for accessibility. But then you have the next one is a kind of about a knowledge then about navigating those systems. So, I mean, tell us a bit about that. And you have this kind of, when you talk about the knowledge of navigation, you have this kind of nice term like belligerent techne. So,
yeah,
you know, like, so tell us a bit about that, like how this kind of picture plays out.
Yeah. So in designed materiality, one of the things that I was trying to do with that concept is really try to capture, there's a lot of conversation around materialism, and both you and I can have like a longer conversation about that as well. But one of the things that I think a lot of materialism ends up not accounting for, like in infrastructure studies, I remember reading, I can't remember who the citation is now, but talking about like the choice of material, the literal choice of material, like the lifespans that concrete enables, or that
which is
steel
important,
enables.
But like,
I think it's critical. It's very important. But designed materiality was trying to remind us that the shapes that materials take is really fundamental for analysis. Like the place that we put a barrier says something about who we're enabling in or enabling out.
Yeah.
Right. So design materiality was trying to do that, and then also capture how, and this is a very pragmatist point that I now realize is a very pragmatist point, is how in the choice of those shapes, we are training people to behave in particular ways. We are creating habits out of design materiality, right? So 150 years of having a transit system that hasn't been designed with disabled passengers in mind, as soon as you start molding that space to bring them in, it's going to create friction. It's a completely new population of users coming in. Yeah. I say completely new with like many caveats, but it's like a new population of users coming in with a population that has been habituated through years of their exclusion to not enable their access.
Yeah, to not deal with them or whatever. Yeah.
Exactly. Yeah. So we can talk about things like drivers ignoring that wheelchair users are waiting for the bus as a classic example of that, because the system still says things like, you need to be on time because every minute that your company is late at the end of the day is a fine for the company, right? Like that's not enabling access in any way. If a wheelchair user needs an extra couple of minutes to get on the bus and that bus is already running a minute or two late. So like all of those things are part of design materiality. It includes things like the design of policies on top of everything else.
Metrics.
So when I then talk about things like belligerent techne is meant to really capture the ways that wheelchair users navigating this transportation system and navigating this design materiality that doesn't take their access needs into consideration fight against the design materiality in new ways, right? So belligerence there, I really like it. It's one of those terms that emerged in conversation with wheelchair users. I didn't pick it because I'm trying to say that they're trying to pick a fight with the system or anything like
super
that.
Punk or something. Yeah,
totally. It's because in conversation with Adam, who was another really, really important interviewee for me, he said something along the lines of like, they know I'm belligerent, when he was like talking about suing Transport for London or calling Transport for London on the phone whenever there was an access problem. He's like, they say about me, do not treat with kid gloves because they know I'm belligerent. And his whole vibe is that like Adam's whole thing is like, you tell me no is not in my vocabulary. Like, I do not believe in that. Like, I will do whatever it takes to get on this bus, to get off this bus, get on this train, get off this train. So to me, like the belligerence there was very much about, I am going to find ways of making the system work for me, even though the system doesn't want to do it. So I used his term of belligerent and then attached it to the idea of techne, of like developing like ways of getting into the grooves of a system,
right,
to really like try and capture some kind of like interruption to the existing designed materiality.
Yeah, I like that. I mean, it's interesting. I've been thinking about this a lot too. I mean, Raquel, as usual, we just need to have like 5-hour conversations or something, just do a whole series. But like it's funny, like the kind of, there's this whole literature. I mean, sometimes it goes back to Winner, but, it's like the values and design kind of side, which, in some hands can really feel like design, like technologies have very strong shaping activities on our behavior and stuff and our habits and all this kind of stuff. But then it's like, well, how much, and that's where your belligerent thing comes in for me, or it's like, well, the users rebel in all kinds of ways. I mean, for me, in my own life, I hung out a lot in architecture spaces when I was in undergrad. One of my closest friends is now an architecture professor at University of Michigan, Tom Moran. And, one of the things we were always studying was like kind of modernist housing blocks and stuff like that, which had like, Corbusier and all these cats had like these utopian visions of how, their architecture was going to kind of control people and make this, one, and then that's not how it happened, and like everyone rebels. They would like hold the doors open. They do all kinds of things. They totally redesign the space. So it's hard, man. And I just like, sometimes I just feel like we're still adrift. Like there's this assumption among some characters that technologies have very strong shaping powers on human behavior, but then there's all these case studies. And Jennifer Hart, if folks will have heard Jennifer Hart's episode before yours, if they're listening to all of them, she shows that like values in technology, but then you take them to other places in the world, and the other places in the world, they have totally different meanings,
Completely.
totally different uses. So it's also a very kind of Western, I don't know, man. I feel like I'm like a total mess on this topic right now, you know?
So that's really funny to me because it's not any different than like classic sociology debates around agency and structure, right?
It's
like,
true. It goes back to that kind of crap. Yeah.
It's just that type. I think it's just an iteration of that type
That's
of
right. I
conversation
think that's
of like,
true. Yeah.
what is the most, is there anything, and like in philosophy, is there any such thing as free will?
Yeah, yeah.
You're like,
There's that.
There's a lot of that is ingrained in that debate, I think.
Yeah.
And it's like, it's funny because at the end of the day, I mean, I'm not going to be like a complete social constructionist about it, but like, these are human. I think that it's really important to underline that these are human decisions, right? The ways that our technologies work and the ways that our technology like shape our lives. Like somebody built that.
Yeah.
Groups of people.
And it has effects. That's clear.
And it has effects. I
right.
mean, I'm trying to think now. I think it's my friend James Searle at the University at Albany, sends me a lot of shit to read. But one of the things, we have like summer reading groups, which are fantastic. And we read an Alf Hornborg piece where he writes, artifacts have consequences, not agency. And he's really like trying to tear into Bruno Latour about
I don't want to go that way
actors.
Either.
Like I'm not going to like go that way, but like it's one of those things of like, artifacts have consequences, and a lot of those consequences, like a lot of them are intended and a lot of them are not, and it's difficult to like piece out those things. I also don't know that like talking about intent. This was some of the critiques that Winner got, right? When Langdon was writing Do Artifacts Have Politics, was the question of intention, like the intentionality of, quote, racist bridges. Like whether Robert Moses actually had that intention. I think that's one of the critiques that I've read about the Artifacts Have Politics piece. And I mentioned that in the book. I don't think intentionality is really, like we can talk about nefarious actors. Obviously, we can talk about nefarious actors. But when I'm talking about like the built environment of public transportation, I don't think I am very invested in the blame game in terms of saying Transport for London is a like evil corporation that refuses to do XYZ. I think that the hole is way further down than that. Yeah. Right? Like the issue is that a lot of these questions are not seen as causes for concern, because of the way that societally, socially, we have been taught to value difference or not value difference. And like, these are the social constructions that I'm interested in, is ultimately all of these assumptions about where disabled people belong, where non-disabled people like should have priority access, the questions of like, well, the debate on the bus, for example, around, wheelchair users versus parents with baby prams. Yeah. Like that to me, for example, is a classic kind of example of like, well, all of a sudden there's like this new space on a bus and parents with babies and prams think that they ought to have priority to that space as well. But as wheelchair users and disabled passengers point out, like they fought for that right and for that space. So like, why is there suddenly this new kind of tension that emerges? A lot of it has to do with value, right? A lot of it has to do with who do we socially deem as valuable? Like the question of like, well, these people reproduced and they are going places. They ought to be given a priority. You're a wheelchair user. You're not going anywhere of importance. Like as though wheelchair users don't have jobs, don't have social dates that they're going out. Like that question of social valuation, I think, is much more nefarious in like that under the radar kind of way, right? And I think that that's much more interesting to talk about publicly than necessarily like evil agency.
Yeah, I'm with you. I think that's right. So, all right. We're going to turn now briefly. I want because really like your new project, and I want the folks to hear a bit about like what you're up to now. So can you tell people about like your big I mean, you mentioned big science earlier. It wasn't an
Yeah.
accident. Like you're on the big science train now. So tell us a bit about
Yeah.
that.
Well, I'm on the big science with infrastructures in
Yeah,
it now,
exactly.
kind of.
Right.
Yeah. I'm continuing the infrastructure stuff. So I not really sure how I got on this. Well, I read Dava Sobel's The Glass Universe a
Uh-huh.
summer, like maybe 4 or 5 years ago or so. And Sobel is really tracing the work that women did in the Harvard Observatory
Mm-hmm.
in that book. That's not what I'm interested in. It was like a brief mention in the book that started all of this. So David Sobel talks about how Harvard sent out expeditions to the global south, well, to the global south in general, but particularly Latin America and Africa, to identify ideal viewing spots to build a
Uh-huh.
Harvard observatory
Okay.
in the South, because the South has better access to viewing the Milky Way.
Okay.
So therefore the rest of the galaxy. And there's apparently, I think it's in Ecuador. I mean, I need to check myself on this, but there is like a mountain in Latin America that's called Mount Harvard as a result of
Okay,
these
right.
expeditions.
Beautiful. Yeah.
So
Those Harvard
that-
assholes, they get it all.
They get it all. And I just like, that was kind of my reaction, was like, are you fucking kidding me? That was like, so that happened. And years before this, as a Nepo baby, my mom was like, hey, it's yours. Like, this was when I was still in my PhD. Hey, it's your Christmas break. Take your break seriously. Come with me to Chile.
Okay.
So she took me to the Atacama Desert for Christmas and New Year. And we went to visit the Atacama Large Millimeter Array.
Okay.
Because STSers are hanging out for Christmas. So as you do, we went to visit a big science observatory.
Yeah.
And we had the tour of like the headquarters. And I was just kind of blown away by what I saw in terms of infrastructure building in the middle of a high altitude desert.
Mm-hmm.
Like that, the vision of that just kind of stuck with me. So ever since all of these things kind of came together, it's important to underline that the Atacama Large Millimeter Array is funded by a consortium of universities, or rather of groups, including the National Science Foundation in the United States, the European Southern Observatory of Europe, which is also a consortium of different countries in Europe, and Japan.
Mm-hmm.
So this is like global North money going into the global South. The concession that was made for Chilean astronomers is that they have 10% of viewing time of the Atacama Large Millimeter Array. This was like a process of negotiation. And actually, Javiera Barandiaran has a great article on astronomy in Chile, kind of tracing how Chile managed to negotiate from 5% to 10% for that agreement. So there's like a lot of interesting things, I think, that happen in relation to Global South. These facilities located in the Global South, and located in the Global South for very particular strategic reasons, right? Like access to particular forms of viewing.
Yeah.
But all financed by the Global North.
Yeah.
In ways that are often kind of pinned as astronomy for development.
Mm-hmm.
So
interesting. Yeah, sure.
You go to the ALMA website, and this is not to knock on National Science Foundation necessarily, but like this is specifically the American ALMA website. There will be like a list of benefits to the community.
Yeah.
Like there's a whole section of the website that talks about benefits to the community. And it will be things like access to telecommunications infrastructure. It will be about these education grants. It will be like medicine. Yeah. There's like all of these claims. I started getting a little bit like, who has studied that? Who has actually studied those claims, like the local benefits to the community?
Well, one of the things I like about the write-ups you've done so far around this is, that you're kind of bringing in this local labor perspective, which I do think will get at like kind of, real materialist analysis of those claims and whether they live up to the hype and, really, because it's fascinating kind of, you create an industry, you can think about it that way. And then, there's jobs, I'm sure it creates villages and stuff, like there's kind of living changes that come out as a result. And I think
Yeah.
examining it in that very kind of concrete and material way is there's a lot of, it's
Yeah.
cool. I'm
I'm
excited.
excited.
Yeah.
So I actually reached out. I couldn't find many people who had written on that very explicitly in terms of
Yeah.
like astronomy art critiques of astronomy for development, or like astronomy as like a local human factors impact kind of
Yeah.
thing.
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah.
And then I linked up with my collaborator, Michael Gastrow, who's located in South Africa. He's one of the few people who I've found who has done this type of analysis.
Yeah.
So his field of work was the Square Kilometer Array, which is located in the Karoo region of South Africa.
Okay.
And that also had some really interesting like land dispute questions that occurred there. So he and I have 2 forthcoming articles on this, one in Science, Technology, and Society and another in Minerva, about like our kind of, one is like a more comparative ALMA Square Kilometer Array like desk review of the situation. And then another one is more of like, here's how here's like how the state of social studies of astronomy on this topic.
Yeah.
Where we've really found that there's like, one, not a lot being done in the area or in the field, which I think is interesting. Like big science was such a huge part of STS in like the 80s and 90s.
Yeah.
And then it seems like everybody just went like, well, it's a thing that we do now.
Yeah, this is how it works, right?
Yeah.
We're done with that shit. That's not cool anymore.
It's just become normal science, right? That seems to kind of have been the end of that claim. And then everybody now who does big science stuff does science evaluation and science policy, right? There doesn't seem to be a whole bunch of people in STS, like going to 4S explicitly doing that amount of like, critical inquiries into big science.
Yeah.
Like, why are we setting up these labs in this way? It's almost like, I feel like I'm being very throwback lab studies about it in a weird way, but we'll see.
That's the hot shit though. That's always the power move, I've realized. This has been my whole life. It's like, team up with grandpa and grandma to kill mom and dad. It's like you just go like one generation further back, and that's how you do it. And then you like that's the move.
Yeah.
And so like it's always like it's how you bring things back is like the flex. But I want to say, so first of all, I don't know if you've ever hung out with Patrick McRae, but he has that giant telescopes book. You definitely need to talk to him. I mean, he has a very different set of...
I've read that. It's great.
Yeah.
One of the things that I love about Patrick's book on that in particular is like, and that's been really helpful to me actually, is like the difference between, and this is critical, I think, in all of the facilities that Michael Gastrow and I are interested in, is the shift of like radar and radio telescopes, right? Like all of the facilities that we're interested in are these huge facilities with huge arrays of satellites, which is very different, not in terms of contestation, because we've seen what's happening in Mauna Kea in Hawaii with the 30-meter telescope, but in terms of like, no astronomer needs to travel on site for these radio telescopes.
Totally.
Right? Observation is remote.
Yeah.
And this changes that. I think that this is critical because it completely changes the dynamic of
that's interesting.
Like people coming to the facility and seeing people's lives around the facility, right?
They don't have their
None
face
of that has to really happen.
Yeah.
So like it's really that aspect that Patrick McRae points out in the shifts in astronomy was really, really critical for me to kind of see that there's something additional happening with radio facilities. But one of the case study that I'm really going to start with is actually Arecibo in Puerto Rico, because, that collapsed in a spectacular cinematic fashion. And I'm really interested in that one too, because I think that speaks a lot to like a very particular form of colonial relationship between the United States and Puerto Rico. And I think that it's like a microcosm of the type of relationships that we then see, like the National Science Foundation expanding to like funding things like in Australia or in South Africa or in Chile.
Yeah, the other person that you got to connect with soon, I think, is another guest who's going to be on soon. I just recorded the intro for it yesterday, is Asif Siddiqui, who is now one of his current projects is he's doing like a global history of space infrastructure.
Oh, awesome.
And so I think you two needed to like be on a panel together or something, and maybe with your collaborator, because I think, you're doing telescopes, he's doing space like stuff, but it's like he's taking a very similar approach in thinking about how these things affect local populations and the environment and all that kind of stuff. So
Oh, that's awesome. Yeah, he and I should link up.
Yeah.
They and I, not sure, sorry.
Yeah. Raquel, I mean, I think the listeners can hear from our tone that we could do this for like 5 more hours and not run out of shit to talk about. But I had a blast with you, as I knew we would, my friend. And I want to thank you very much for coming on and talking to me today.
This was awesome. Thanks so much for having me.
I hope you enjoyed this episode of our podcast. You can reach us with questions, comments, and suggestions at leevinsel@gmail.com or by following me on Twitter at STS_news or on YouTube at People's Things. Our podcast is distributed by the New Books Network, the leading platform for academic podcasts, so that you can find us wherever you get your podcasts. Peoples and Things, like most things in this world, depends on the work of many people. I want to thank my brother Jake Vinsel for writing the music for the show. I want to thank my buddy Juliana Castro for designing the logos for the podcast. You can check out her work at julianacastro.co. Joe Fort is the producer for the podcast, and Mandy Lamb is the production assistant. This podcast and other Peoples and Things programming are produced in affiliation with Virginia Tech Publishing and supported by the Center for Humanities and the University Libraries at Virginia Tech. For information about other podcasts from Virginia Tech Publishing, visit publishing.vt.edu. For the entire Peoples and Things team, I am Lee Vinsel. And most importantly, I want to thank you for listening. Thanks.